right, welcome everybody. Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Almond Conference. I have a couple of quick notes before we start, and my apologies since you may have already heard some of this, but we do have, it is the first day for several folks, so I just want to emphasize that please look through your programs carefully, as we have once again assembled a great line of hot topics, speakers, and special events. Also, a special thanks to the last night's opening reception sponsor, Alsem, for sponsoring such a fun event. It was really cool. And I would like to also give a special thanks to the metal sponsors that you can see here in the screen. They are really who make this event possible, so thank you very much to all of our metal sponsors, all the sponsors in general as well. So if you have yet to purchase tickets to tonight's gala dinner, be sure to check with the registration area on the first floor. After this session, they will be there, and you can purchase gala tickets if they are available. Cocktail hours begin at 6 p.m., and doors to the gala dinner will open at 7 p.m. And if you haven't purchased a ticket for today's lunch, don't fear. The food truck village is open until 2 p.m. on the west lobby of the plaza. So now let's dive into today's presentation. Well, that's what I was mentioning about the food trucks. And I'm gonna go there. So one of the pillars of our production research portfolio is to generate new knowledge and discover innovative methods for growing almonds in California. This approach aims to reduce input costs by maximizing the efficiency of our current practice or introducing new ones. So along these lines, I've organized this session where I have asked the 5 UC researchers leaders you can see on the screen, and besides me, to provide updates on their latest work. So next you will hear from them about avoiding pruning, increasing fertigation efficiency, and fine-tuning orchard configuration, among other practices. So we only have 1 hour for this session, so fasten your seatbelts and let's roll, and let's start with the first speaker, Duncan.
Thank you, Sebastian. Good morning, everybody. I'm Duncan, UC Farm Advisor in Stanislaus County, and actually I'm going to talk about old data, some data that has been accumulated for many, many years. So the first part is going to be on pruning, and then the next some ideas about orchard or tree spacing within an orchard. So right now, I think a lot of growers are kind of deciding, should we prune or should we not prune? And I think I'm going to go through some numbers here that hopefully will convince you that you probably don't need to prune. Sebastian just shared some numbers with me from a survey that they just took, and I was surprised actually with the number of growers that are still pruning every year with the idea of maintaining yield. I think that right up front we need to understand that pruning itself is a dwarfing process. We're removing canopy, we're removing structure that are, the trees are producing carbohydrates, we're reducing the fruit-bearing area, and we've seen that where we prune heavily, we are reducing root growth as well. So pruning is a yield-reducing practice, and I think that's probably a fundamental truth in all fruit and nut tree production. And the more you prune, the more yield is reduced. Now, in this case, we're talking about training trees, and so we train for a reason, but we still have to understand that when we do that, it's a yield-reducing practice, at least in the short term, at least for the next couple of years. So here's a trial, was during the 1980s, 1990s. It wasn't started by John Edstrom, but John took it over at the Nichols Estate. And I'm just gonna, I don't have a pointer that works here, so just look at the top 2 rows. You see the difference between trees that were pruned annually for 21 years versus trees that were pruned for a couple of years just to get them started, and then essentially unpruned for 19 or 20 years. And you can see in the far right column the cumulative yield. And there's very little difference between whether you pruned for 20 years or didn't prune at all for 20 years. Not much difference. In fact, where you didn't prune, they're about 900 pounds or so to the good. And you can kind of look at the difference between 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st leaf, and you can see that yields really did not drop off at the end, which is something that we used to think, years ago. This is a different trial. Again, there have been so many trials that have been done throughout California, different locations, long-term trials, and it's amazing how consistent they are. So this is a trial in Kern County by Mario Viveros, retired many years ago. So this was only through 11 years. And there are a lot of different pruning strategies here, but if you just look at the top row and the bottom row, and you look at annual pruning versus trees that were not pruned, and you look at the nonpareil, Carmel, and the Monterey, and in each case, there's not much difference between pruning and not pruning, but the trend is, the less that you prune, the more the yield that you end up with. And this is in the short term, and it's in the long term. And so these are what untrained trees look like in the current trial. Not a disaster. Again, I think 20 years ago, a lot of people would have looked at that and thought, whoa, this is terrible. But today's world, I think you can look at that and go, yeah, that's not so bad. So this is a third trial. This is one that I held in Stanislaus County for about 20 years. And again, we'll just look at the top two rows there. So trained to 3 scaffolds initially, and then moderate pruning every year versus the second row, which is trained to 3 scaffolds for the first couple of years and then remained untrained for 17, 18 years. And you look at the cumulative yield and the last year for nonpareil and Carmel, and you can see that in the 19th leaf, the yields are almost identical, whether you pruned or didn't prune for 20 years. And then cumulatively, not a lot of difference at all in the nonpareil especially. In the Carmel, actually, there was a little bit of a yield increase where we didn't prune much. So the bottom line is really, if you're going to you're not going to improve your yield in the short term or the long term, why are you spending whatever it is now, $300 or more dollars an acre to do that? So we know that pruning did not increase yield in the short term or the long term in the Stanislaus County trial. It either had no effect or it reduced yield. And then if you add up all the numbers, and I used $275 an acre, but I think now it's probably more like $350 when you count stacking and shredding and all of that. So yeah, we figured that if we would have pruned every year, we would have lost between $7,500 and $14,000 per acre over the time. So I'm going to go through this. I'm not even going to talk about the topping, other than we did it. We looked at mechanical topping and not mechanical topping, and looked at it for 4 years of yield, and mechanical topping, same idea. If you didn't do any training, no pruning, no topping, the yield was the best. The more you pruned, the harder you pruned, the less the yield. So that's just for the first 4 years. Okay, so I think I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm gonna have to move on out of that. So I think we can just establish that, thank you, that pruning does not increase yield in the short term or the long term. And so if you prune, you have to have a reason for it. So there are a lot of reasons to prune. You have to have structural integrity of the tree. You're pruning to get stuff out of the way of the machinery, and for worker safety and that sort of a thing. But the idea of keeping this, the inside prune and keeping the light distribution to maintain that lower crop, it's just not true. And it's just been shown over and over and over again. So I'm hoping that the 45% or whatever it is of people who continue to prune will look at this and say, why in the world am I doing that? Okay, so now we'll shift gears a little bit. This is another very long-term trial looking at orchard spacing, or basically looking just down the row. How do we, should we be putting trees closer or farther apart down the row? So in this case, we looked at a trial for about 22 years, and we had trees spaced differently down the row. So this is kind of an overhead shot, and you can kind of see 4 rows. I can't point again, but you got 4 rows of nonpareil Carmel, nonpareil Sonora that are planted 10 feet apart, and the next 4 rows are planted 22 feet apart. The next 4 rows are 14 feet apart. So we just kind of monitored those for over 20 years to see what happens. Bruce Lampinen runs his magic light meter through every year, and so we've seen that essentially the farther apart the trees are spaced, the less sunshine those trees are capturing. And not only do they peak at that 11 or 12 leaf year, which is very common throughout California in most orchards, Bruce will say. That's a normal thing. You peak production at 11 or 12, or you peak your sunlight capture at 11 or 12 years, and then you get a slow drop off. So what we saw was that, you know, more tightly spaced trees captured more sun at their peak, and they dropped off more slowly than trees that were planted far apart. So looking at yield, hey, you've got nonpareil and Carmel trees, you got Nemegard rootstock and Hansen rootstock, which is a vigorous rootstock, and you can just kind of see the difference in the spacing there. And again, the bottom line is that at least for trees that are of moderate vigor, you're better off planting them, you know, 10 or 14 feet apart than 18 or 22 feet apart in terms of yield. Now the spacing thing is a little bit unclear still. If you look at the nonpareil trees that are on Hansen, numerically speaking, and I realize there are no statistics on these slides now, on this slide, but numerically speaking, actually the spacing at 18 feet was better for the nonpareil on Hansen. But not much difference, really, through all these years. So, I don't know, again, what should you be planting? What is the best spacing? I think this is still up for debate. Maybe Brian in the talk following me will have shed some light on that. But one of the things that's interesting is that when you put trees closer together down the row, they are smaller, and there are some real benefits to that. So if you look at this, there's two lines. The top line are the trunk circumference, so how big around the trunk is on trees that are on Hansen, very vigorous rootstock at 10, 14, 18, and 22 feet apart. And then the lower line is the trees on Nemegard. So what does that show? Shows that trees on Hansen are more vigorous, the trees are bigger, but also shows that as you move from 10 to 14 to 18 to 22 feet, the trees get bigger. And there are some consequences of that. We've seen, you know, trees that fall apart. We saw, you know, just a real relationship. The closer the trees are together, the less problem that we have with scaffold breaking and trees falling apart, regardless of how they are spaced, or I'm sorry, regardless of how they are pruned. There's also real effects on shaker injury. So the larger the tree is, or the wider the trees are spaced, the larger the trees get. That means they're harder to shake. We ended up with more shaker injury. And again, so this is, you know, by the 13th leaf, we're looking at the percentage of trees with shaker injury. And again, it's a linear deal. The closer the trees are together, the easier they are to shake, then the less shaker injury that we end up with. And when you add up the difference, or this all together of trees that have shaker injury, trees that fall apart from scaffold breakage and other problems, this is the number of replants that were planted every year. And again, it's the same pattern. The farther the trees are apart, the more replants are needed through the years. And of course, a tree that's, if you lose a tree at 22 by 22, it hurts a lot more than a tree that's, you know, 10 by 22. And this is a little harder to read than I want it to be, but the bottom line here is that tighter in-row spacing results in fewer mummies. So in a year like this year, when we had so much navel orangeworm problem, you know, if you had big trees that they're spaced 18 or 22 feet apart, they're so hard to shake and get those mummies out. Trees that are 10 feet apart are much easier to shake, and the mummies come out much better. So you get a more complete harvest and not as much of a navel orangeworm pressure the following year. So here's a photograph from last winter of 20th leaf Carmel and nonpareil trees on Hansen rootstock. Looked at two different spacings. So on your left is the 22 by 22, and on your right are trees that are 10 by 22. So this is a Hansen really vigorous rootstock, and what you kind of see down the middle is where the trees that are on 22 by 22, the trees grow up and over the row. Some growers would see that and say, you know what, I need to hedge that. But on the trees that are spaced 10 feet apart, they never come together across the row. So you reduce this, you get better light transfer, which is, I think, the opposite of what you would expect. You get better light penetration into the lower canopy, and we just see longer tree life. So I think I'll just leave it with that because I think my time is up, and I will pass it on to the next speaker. Right? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, good morning. I'm Brian Bailey. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Plant Sciences at UC Davis. And you heard a little bit about some of the excellent experimental work that's going on to better understand almond system production. You'll hear more about that throughout the different talks. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the modeling work that we've been doing to help leverage and expand on that excellent experimental work that's going on. So if we take a quick step back and think about how do we innovate or discover new knowledge in orchard systems, as probably everyone's familiar with, this is usually through a set of experiments where we have some idea or question we want to test, and then we do some different experiments to test that and determine if it's worthy going into production. This is essential, but the downside is that it's a relatively slow process. As Roger illustrated, it can take many years to even decades to kind of get your answer back. So essentially what we're working to do is to incorporate a simulation or modeling loop within this process such that we can run through lots of different scenarios with all different combinations of variables that you could never do in an experimental environment. And then use that to kind of reduce down the range of scenarios that need to be tested in those field trials. So we're not trying to remove the need for field trials in any sense, but the idea is to add value by being able to accelerate this process and make it more efficient. So to this end, there we go. So to this end, we've been developing, it was set to autoplay. Okay. So we've been developing this three-dimensional orchard modeling framework called Helios, where the idea is that we build up the full geometry of the orchard system. We do this using LiDAR scanning, and then we also make some measurements of the plant physiology and function. And then we put all of this together and input it into a model that allows us to examine different processes like light interception, water use efficiency. We can also change variables to do what-if type experiments and simulation to see what will happen, again, to help to understand these interactions, to be able to vary a lot of different variables that you couldn't do in an experimental setting. So just as a few examples, we've been collaborating with Franz, who you'll hear from in a moment, at the Nichols Soil Lab. Here we reconstructed these different varieties. We were interested in the impacts of different growth habit and variety combinations. We've also been collaborating with Roger on his configuration trial, where we went in and scanned and reconstructed the trees. These are showing leaf off because you get this nice well-defined picture of the structure, but we can also obviously put the leaves on and simulate what happens during the growing season. So there are many potential applications that we are interested in. Orchard configuration, design, as I have several slides on this, and you heard a little bit about that previously. We also do quite a bit of work with irrigation system design and management. We're working on bringing in the irrigation component of the system. So we're working on integrating models of the irrigation system hydraulics, transport and uptake of water in the soil, as well as the above ground demand and how that all changes with the configuration or other variables of the system. And I have one slide on that. Pruning, thinning, examining what might happen when we under certain pruning and thinning scenarios, again, hopefully to reduce our need to actually do that, as was mentioned in the previous talk. And sort of more broadly, the idea is to be able to simulate any action that a manager or designer might take to ask what will happen if I do this certain practice or design choice, and test different hypotheses in a simulated or in silico environment. So I added just a few example applications, and it's important to stress that these are just meant to be illustrative. There's a lot of nuance here that I won't have time to get into. So again, they're just illustrative, not necessarily making kind of a hard recommendation. So important to keep in mind. So one of many different scenarios or questions that we tested is If we are to alternate an upright variety like an Aldrich with a more balanced or sprawling type of architecture like a nonpareil, can this increase our yields because it gives more space for the more profitable variety to spread out and increase its yield? An alternate hypothesis is that perhaps this additional yield might be negated by shading from the larger variety, so you will get essentially no net benefit or no free lunch. So we can examine this in a simulated environment. Obviously, this isn't a typical configuration that you would see in a production system, but that's the luxury of a simulated environment, is that we can kind of control different variables just to try and understand what's going on. So we simulated two different cases, one where you have alternating Aldrich and nonpareil, such that we allowed enough time that the nonpareil could kind of take up that additional space that was allotted to it. And then just as a control, we said, what if you had just nonpareil only? Again, you would never have this in reality, but it was kind of a control case to compare against. Essentially what you find is that you shift from the Aldrich to the nonpareil based on the amount of space that it can take up. So the nonpareil on a per tree basis intercepted more light, had higher photosynthesis. Interestingly, the water use efficiency of both varieties went down relative to the sort of monoculture with only the one variety. This is also north-south rows. We could look at what happens on a whole orchard basis by just summing all of that up. So we essentially found that the light interception and photosynthesis on a whole orchard basis didn't change, so you were just kind of shifting those around, but the water use efficiency did go down on the whole orchard basis. And then we could say, what if we were to have east-west rows? Would this change our outcome? And in fact, it does. It amplifies that difference between the two varieties, as you would kind of expect. So you get even more light interception from the nonpareil and more photosynthesis, but still you get decreased water use efficiency overall. If we look at a whole orchard basis, now you get higher light interception on a whole orchard basis when you have the mixture as well as photosynthesis, but water use efficiency goes down. So if you can get a premium for the nonpareil nuts, for example, relative to the pollinizers, then you could potentially see an overall profit increase. There are a lot of other variables to consider as well, but just kind of one scenario. I'll skip this because I think I don't have time, but this is on our poster. And the last example is related to irrigation. So the question was, should we irrigate differently based on variety? So we had this experimental orchard managed by Ken Shackle, where we had 50% nonpareil, 25% Monterey, and 25% wood colony. So we went in and laser scanned the orchard, reconstructed them, and then ran them through the models in order to determine the tree by tree water usage as well as the integrated water usage by variety. Indeed, we found quite different water usage among the variety, with the largest nonpareil being the highest water users, then Monterey, and then the smallest wood colony. So we just did some calculations to say, what if you irrigated each variety based on their water needs relative to just a uniform irrigation based on the largest nonpareil trees? And we found that you could potentially save about 20% of the water. If you could just realize a fraction of that in reality, then that could be a significant water savings based on that. All right, and I think I'm out of time, so thanks for your attention. Oh, I was very short.
Good morning. I'm Franz Niederholzer. I'm a tree crop advisor with UC Cooperative Extension in Colusa County, and I'm also the research coordinator at the Nickel Soil Lab in Arbuckle, which is also in Colusa County. So I'm reviewing updating you on three projects that are long-term projects at the Nickel Soils Lab. There's also a poster with much more detail, so I'm going to blow through this quickly, and please come see me or check out the poster. There's more information there. Things we're looking at, comparing self-fertile and traditional planting performance. There was an organic demonstration orchard, and then looking at optimum spacing down the row with similar, basically copying what Roger's done, but we're using different rootstocks, different location, How does spacing play out on gravelly loam Class 2, Class 3 soils in the Sacramento Valley? And then, well, the pollinator combos, that's something that's not addressed here, but come on by the poster, we can talk about that one. The self-fertile traditional planting performance was something that John Edstrom, my predecessor, suggested we look at. This was when interest in independence was just beginning to swing up. What's the yield like? 100% independence compared to non-Perel, Aldrich, and Sonora, the 75% soft shell, high quality. This particular planting's on Viking, 15 by 20, again, Class 2, Class 3 ground, double line drip, was planted in 13. This is annual yield production from independence over the years. Don't look at the numbers on the actual production. This is, again, small. The trees aren't that big relative to with the rootstocks and soil site. But what I would take away from this slide is the relative smooth curve. There's not a lot of jumping around. Production's very consistent with independence at this site over time. Comparing to, this is non-Perel over time, same spacing, the trees are all treated the same. You have excellent years and you've got crummy years relative to the very consistent independence. You've got 2020 when we had that huge crop, is a beautiful year for set, and then followed by maybe an off year from alternate bearing. You've got frost in 18, crummy cool bloom in 22 and 23. Anyhow, a real difference from year to year. Aldrich similarly tracks the independence with a big bump in that very, very good year of 2020. And the big disappointment, if you will, or from a grower standpoint, has been Sonora, which had a tremendous year in 2020, but as you can see in the cold bloom year of 18, and you've got the alternate bearing year of 21, and then 22 and 23 have been cool and wet, and they just have not done that well. So if you look at gross income per acre using Blue Diamond's numbers over the years, some years, they've all been different up until recently. So to say there was one absolute winner over the whole seasons to date, there isn't one. Cumulative yields, when you add them all up over time, income over time, there is no significant difference statistically. So it just depends from year to year. Great years, the self-infertile varieties do well, but the independence has been very consistent. And the difference you see there, the drop-off has really been price over time. Something that John planted with Bill Kruger years ago was asking the question, how do organic almonds do in the Sacramento Valley? In a on-purpose, intentional planting that was set up from the get-go to be organic. You'll see here, John's non-Perel's not, at least you don't get overwintering cankers from brown rot and non-Perel. There might be some impact on yield, but it's relatively tolerant of brown rot over time. So, and also you got nice yield at 75% non-Perel, at least income. With Fritz pollinizers, every fourth tree down the row, and those trees are offset. Every non-Perel's got 2 Fritz next to it, somewhere around of the 6 trees around it. Double line berry drip to allow for weed control in the organic using propane burners. 16 by 22 is a successful planting spacing at the Nichols on our Class 2 ground, and it was planted in the spring of '06. And organic yield's been 60 to 80% of conventional production. Early on there through 2012, we had, there was a fair amount of rust in the organic block, and once that, we talked to Brent Holtz, and he suggested sulfur sprays ahead of rain events, regular sulfur sprays through the summer, and that has turned the corner. But unfortunately, that meant that we were cropping the trees harder, and we couldn't keep the nitrogen in them, so they bounce around. And then getting towards the later part of the curve, this is a level rooted block on berry drip with bad water the last couple of years, so you've got the challenge of low nitrogen in the organic, plus trees are losing some trees. So over time, and this is the Nichols Soils Lab's almost 300 feet above sea level. So we're up off the valley floor a little bit. We dodged the bullet on some of the colder weather that's been coming around the last few years. We've increased production to 60, 80% of conventional. We have not had train wrecks with mite and insect control. Last year was an awful year for navel orangeworm. Previous to this last year, we did use netting disruption, and we stayed away from disruptive insecticides, organic insecticides targeting navel orangeworm. Our big challenges are cost-effective nitrogen nutrition. Organic nitrogen, certified organic nitrogen is expensive, particularly liquid form. Plugging in the irrigation lines without Treflon can be an issue. Level rootstock late in life is not that resilient. And cover crop establishment with berry drip in a drought year is, it's not going to work. Anyhow, something we tried the last few years is using pelletized feather meal. It's about half the cost per unit of nitrogen for an organic source versus a liquid material. We've been using this Ag Pro pneumatic cedar fertilizer. It's done very nicely. Comes with a shank. We're putting out 800 pounds of the acre of material to deliver 100 pounds of nitrogen with this. You have to drive very slowly, but we were able to get the material in an efficient means closer to the trees where the nitrogen can get to the root system. This last year, we weren't able to use the machine. We tried to broadcast the pelletized feather meal at that same rate and then rototilled it in, and we were not very successful in maintaining our nitrogen levels as we would have been if we could have buried it. But that messes up your, can I go back? That does mess up your orchard floor. Can catch nuts if you're dropping the nuts directly in with a regular shake. So catch frame harvesters may have a bigger role in organic production based on whether it's the need or the choice to interfere with the orchard floor using the shanks. So something to consider. We've been working with Eric Nielsen Enterprises. That picture on the right is from the organic trial at Nichols. They're shaking to a catch frame and dropping them in the row. We go through, so there's no need to sweep. We go through with the conditioner and get the extra leaves out, but they dry fairly nicely in the windrow as such. Okay. Finally, this is basically a repeat of Roger's trial with different rootstocks and varieties more common in our area. I'm going to jump forward for a second. It's 50% nonpareil, 25% Aldrich, 25% Kester. We went with Kester because we were trying to get away from Monterey. Aldrich and Kester come off about the same time, so you get 2 harvests instead of 3 if we had used Monterey instead of Kester. Double line drip. We're at 12, 14, 16, or 18 feet down the row at 21 feet across, just reflecting the vigor of the site. We use Titan, Peach Almond Hybrid, or Root Pack R Almond Plum Hybrid. They're planted in 17. Again, this is very similar to Rogers. We're just using Aldrich, different pollinizers and slightly different rootstocks, although Hansen and Titan they're both Peach Almond hybrids, very vigorous. Root Pack R is less vigorous than Level. They're smaller trees. So when I put this together a couple of weeks ago, there had been no influence of tree spacing and almond yield, but I crunched the numbers from the 23 since, sent the slide in, and come on down to the poster. We can have the most recent data. There's not dramatic difference over time, but there are some improvements in production with a tighter spacing, 12 or 14 feet versus 16 to 18 feet in these locations. And along the lines of some things Brian was pointing out, on the smaller rootstock, on the root pack R, Aldrich planted closer together cumulatively has more production at 12 feet than 18 feet, not so much in the middling to 14 to 16. But there's quite a bit of information we've generated, and be happy to talk about it at the poster. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much and welcome everybody. I'm going to present a talk and some slides which many of you would have seen before. My goal here is to reiterate the critical principles about how to manage nutrients efficiently. So if I go through a particular slide quickly, I'll be hanging around after this talk and you can ask me for more of the details. So when we think about managing nutrients overall, we always have to think about our goal is the balance between supply, all of the inputs of nitrogen into the system, and the demand of the tree, with the goal of maximizing your efficiency. Now, in this system, you need to ask the questions, how much is needed for my particular orchard, my particular crop? When is it needed? The timing of application, how you should apply it, placement, source, etc. Oops, that's interesting. One of the things to think about is that we're trying to minimize losses. That's ultimately the goal of using this consideration of rate and timing and placement. Our goal is to minimize losses for two purposes. Obviously, any loss is a lack of efficiency, but any loss is also a source of greenhouse gases for pollution or a source of nitrate for pollution into the groundwater. There's one fundamental principle about plant nutrients that's true across all of the different nutrients, and that is uptake of nutrients from the soil is not uniform as you increase application. So starting on the left-hand side of that graph is what sort of concentrations of nitrogen you might find in the soil in an unfertilized field. And you see in an unfertilized field, as you increase the nitrogen just a little bit, you get very rapid uptake of all the available nitrogen. This is how plants survive in a native unfertilized environment. As you start to fertilize, the plant initiates a new process of uptake, and you can see that second curve that is capable of taking up a lot more nitrogen. But an important thing to note here is it becomes saturated. And as you go past a certain point, the plant can no longer take that nitrogen from the environment. What happens, therefore, is a large proportion of that nitrogen will sit in the root zone, waiting for the plant to catch up. You can think of it a little bit equivalent to this. If you give too much, if you feed that cheetah lion an entire zebra, there's a certain point where it cannot eat anymore. And that zebra lying on the ground is going to be scavenged by hyenas and everything else. And the same is true with plant nutrients. That which is not used, has potential loss. The arrow on the left is the sort of concentrations that would go into an irrigation system if you fertilized weekly or even daily, a continuous fertilization process. That arrow on the right is what happens when you do a fertilization where you're putting a month's worth of nitrogen on in a single slug. This is an important principle because it underlies where and how inefficiencies occur. The reason it's important, this is some very old data, and I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, is that nitrate forms of nitrogen move through the soil very, very rapidly. This is an experiment where we didn't do this, this is an old experiment. You put either ammonium on the top of the soil or urea or nitrate. The purple is nitrate. You irrigate for 90 minutes and you come back and you ask the question, where is my nitrogen? And that bottom curve, which is the nitrate curve, shows you that that nitrogen within 90 minutes of irrigation has moved 9 inches into the soil. So you can imagine a large pool of nitrogen sitting on the soil surface because you applied too much. 2, 3, 4, 5 irrigation events, you really can lose your nitrogen. So let's look a little bit at how we derive the nuance to optimize how to fertilize. Okay, we know we can't put it all on the ground in January and hope it's still there in December, just as you wouldn't give a piggery or the pig all of its food in January and hope that it's healthy in December. Simply can't happen. We've done a lot of work over the last 20 years to work out how and when trees take up nitrogen from the soil. So this is a graph here, starting in January, going all the way through to December, looking at the percent of the total annual nitrogen demand that is taken up at different points in the curve. So you notice no uptake from the soil before about 70% leaf out. That happens because the tree is is utilizing the reserves that it put into place in the previous year. And until those reserves are consumed, new uptake doesn't occur. Once you've got through 70% leaf out and you've got a good crop on the tree, then uptake increases dramatically through that nut fill period. Now, there's some important period late in the year where bud initiation and reserve refill occurs. That's going to be next year's supply that's going to get you through to that 70% leaf out. An ideal fertilization might be one that looks like this, with applications neatly timed or precisely timed to this curve. If you do less frequent fertilization but larger amounts, you will then have a number of periods where the nitrogen must sit in the profile waiting for the plant to catch up. And particularly early in the year, particularly if you're in some of the wetter zones like the Sacramento Valley, those early excesses are particularly prone to losses from rainfall, irrigation, and other events. So you have an increasing number of periods where there's excess availability of nutrients and hence the potential for loss. So immediately with these principles, it's pretty clear that efficiency will always be optimized by the more frequently you put a fertilization on the ground. Now, there's a lot of things I've wrapped into these diagrams. Last year, the Almond Board put out a nitrogen management best practices pamphlet. It's available online. It's available as a pamphlet. And it describes these principles and prescribes what an ideal fertilization strategy is. There's another important consideration here, is that question of the placement of the nitrogen. It remains true that even if, for example, I put too much nitrogen on the ground in April, it doesn't mean it's lost. It means it has the potential for loss. That nitrogen on the surface of the soil in the top 5 inches will be lost if water moves through the profile. If by some miracle you can constrain and prevent nitrogen moving through the profile, it won't be lost. But the reality is we are irrigating. So it's important to think about that interaction between irrigation and nitrogen movement. So we've done a lot of experiments over the years to ask the question, where are the active roots in an irrigated almond orchard? And repeatedly we come back with the conclusion that the vast majority of almond roots, particularly the young ones that are very active in feeding, are within the top 18 inches of soil. Certainly you have large structural roots bigger than that, but they are a small percentage of the root volume. The majority is in that top zone. And so it tells you your goal is to keep your nitrogen in that top 18 inches. That is the goal. How do you achieve that? You achieve that through the integration of how and when you fertilize and how and when you irrigate. Your goal, optimum irrigation, is fertilizer application towards the end of the irrigation event so that you don't push it through the profile. This is another example of where having small spoon-feeding applications minimizes the potential of pushing the nitrogen through the profile. A very large application, which is followed by 4 or 5 or 6 irrigations, will have a good potential of pushing that nutrient through the profile. So again, this is outlined in the Best Management Practices Guideline. Another important consideration, which we often don't think about, is the interaction between distribution uniformity of irrigation and distribution uniformity of fertilization. And it's self-evident once you put it down on paper that if you have on the left there a very uniform irrigation system, you inject in a year 250 pounds worth of nitrogen, you will be able to deliver that 250 pounds uniformly across the orchard. If you have a distribution uniformity that's poor, 70% in this case, not only are you not distributing water uniformly, but every time you do an injection of a fertilizer, you're also not distributing the fertilizer uniformly. And it can have, as you can see in this model here, a very dramatic effect on which portions of the orchard get more or less nitrogen. And the reality in management of nitrogen and minimizing losses is trying to get the right amount of nitrogen to the plant at the right time. This distribution you see on the right here will inevitably be excess nitrogen to a large portion of the field. Best practices talks you through this, describes these processes, describes these principles, but also there are nitrogen management tools on the CASP site, on the sustainability site, that you can put in information about your irrigation system, your expected yield, your planting densities, your background nitrogen, and it will run iterations to help you define what is perfect, what is the best thing to do. Now, granted, continuous fertigation requires a dedicated equipment, which some of you do not have. Increasingly, people are getting it. But once we start to think about the necessity for optimization to save money and maximize efficiency, the necessity to be compliant with Air Resources Board and groundwater regulations on nitrogen loss, it becomes a bit of a no-brainer, and this sort of uniformity and efficiency maximizes productivity. Just back to that same principle. And so this is a core principle when thinking about the input of any resource into an agricultural system, and particularly with nitrogen. Once you have that excess, as I said, in this case, that zebra could be wasted if the hyenas get in there because the line is full and cannot take anything more in. It is also the condition under which inefficiencies occur and losses occur, whether it's nitrate leaching, and hence all the imposition that makes with the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, or gaseous nitrogen losses and the implications that has for the Air Resources Board. So we have an experiment here. This is work from Patrick Nichols, who's just finished his PhD, just published this article in Soil Science, looking at what does different irrigation practices, what do they do to the efficiency or the losses, in this case, of greenhouse gases. So nitrogen volatilizing off the surface, contributing to air pollution. 2015 at the top, episodic means once every month or 2 months a fertilization event. Continuous means fertilization every irrigation event. And the difference there, the 1,000 versus the 474, this is grams. So this is not a lot of nitrogen, that's 1 kilogram of nitrogen, but it is a lot of greenhouse gas. And you see the dramatic difference between how much greenhouse gas is blown off when you do this episodic fertigation, once a month, once every 2 months, versus continuous. And what you see in terms of relative efficiency of nitrogen losses from the gas would be replicated with nitrate losses. So the same principles apply. If there is an excess, loss will be increased. The second year, the numbers are smaller, but the difference is every bit as big. So that's all I have to say. Managing nitrogen is about thinking of these different principles. It's very clear from what we've done that for profitability, efficiency, lack of nitrogen loss, and environmental considerations, that continuous fertilization strategy, according to that graph, the curve that you see there, is the secret to success. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Thomas Harter. I'm a professor of cooperative extension, and I work in the groundwater agriculture nexus space. I come to this from the groundwater side and from the soil side. I'm a hydrologist, and I'm going to follow up on all that's been said this morning, especially what Patrick just referred to, and give you some insights on these nitrogen losses that go to groundwater and how they impact groundwater. This is work that I'm doing with Spencer Jordan, who is here and who will be at the poster, and all of the slides that I'm showing will be also in his poster, and I have to give credit to him for preparing a lot of those graphics. Will Lennon and Tina Stockert have been doing a lot of the field work, and I also want to acknowledge Felix Ogunmoken and my colleague Isaiah Kisika for supporting us in this work. Patrick mentioned the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program and nitrate losses to groundwater. The nitrogen that you apply into the orchard is subject to a very simple mass balance. Everything is going to be accounted for. Either it goes into the tree and into your fruit, or it goes into the atmosphere, or it leaches to groundwater. Very little is running off into surface water in the Central Valley. So the losses that Patrick talked about, the hyenas, are the atmospheric losses which have greenhouse gas impacts, and the losses to groundwater in form of nitrate, nitrogen as nitrate, where it impacts the quality of your domestic well and of public water supply wells. And the fact that in some counties in the valley we have more than 40% of wells exceeding health standards for nitrate has driven the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. And your agricultural water quality coalitions that you're all members of have worked with the regulatory agencies, the Central Valley Regional Water Board, in developing targets for nitrogen losses that will in the future be protective of groundwater quality to ensure that we sustain the quality of groundwater or improve the quality of groundwater. And these targets, which were published last year, for many areas in the Central Valley are now lying between about 20 and 60 pounds of nitrogen losses going to groundwater. And what that means is that of what you apply, figure of 5 to 10% might be going into the atmosphere, but not a whole lot more than 10% can actually be lost to groundwater either. So one of the project that we're engaged in is looking at what happens to that nitrogen and how does the type of practices that Patrick referred to with high irrigation efficiency and high nitrogen fertigation efficiency, how does that help us have less hyenas come to the zebra, have less nitrate losses going to groundwater? To do this, we're working with a cooperator in Stanislaus County that Roger and staff at the Almond Board connected us with many years ago, where in 2017 we established probably the most extensive groundwater monitoring well network that we have in any orchard in this country. We have a veto zone monitoring network looking at the root zone and just below the root zone, looking at water movement and nitrogen movement in the root zone. And we're looking at all the water coming in, the nitrogen coming into the orchard, and the water that transpires out of the orchard, as well as the nitrogen that moves out of the orchard in form of harvest. And what we're finding there is the switch from a standard management where fertilizer was applied maybe every 2 to 3 weeks prior to 2018 or 2017 to this, what we call high frequency, low concentration fertigation, where in every irrigation, which is highly efficient with drip and micro sprinklers and or micro sprinklers, with every irrigation we apply a little bit of nitrogen pretty much along the lines of the curve that Patrick just showed. Our nitrogen use efficiency, if we take all of the nitrogen inputs and outputs into account, jumped from about 68% to 85%. If you look at the difference to 1, that means the losses that are going somewhere else have been reduced from 32% to 15%. We have half of the losses going to either in the atmosphere or to groundwater. That's a huge difference. We're seeing with this fertigation regime a significant reduction in the nitrogen concentrations in that pore water profile that's in the root zone, especially at the end of the season. We're not doing any fall irrigation, any fall fertigations. So by the end of the season in November, December, we're now at much, much lower nitrate concentrations in that profile, in that root zone profile than we had been before. We're also seeing much lower end of season mobile nitrogen concentrations in the soil samples since we've switched from standard practices to this HFLC practice. So in terms of 2 of our 3 monitoring systems, in terms of just balancing water input and nitrogen input, and in terms of what's happening in the root zone and just below the root zone, we've clearly seen improvements right away when we switch to this really efficient way of managing the nitrogen. Where Spencer comes in is in the same way where Brian comes into the equation. Brian and Spencer both model these orchards. Brian models your orchard trees, your orchard irrigation lines, and can play what-if scenarios. And he can take data, and he does take data to make sure that orchard actually represents a real orchard. Similarly, we take the data that Will and Tina and others have collected in our video zone sampling network, in our groundwater sampling network, to build models of the subsurface below the orchard, both the root zone, the unsaturated zone below that to the water table, and of the groundwater below that unsaturated zone to understand how nitrogen and water move through that system and how management practices impact the concentrations of groundwater, of nitrate in groundwater. And what Spencer's work and his predecessor's work is showing that because we're irrigating very efficiently, we're moving water relatively slowly through that unsaturated zone that's below the root zone to the water table at about 20 feet in this case, which means that in groundwater, we wouldn't be expecting improvements for maybe a decade or 2 decades. And that's shown in these simulations. These simulations show the concentration of nitrate right where it leaches to the water table as simulated with a simulator similar to what Brian had shown. And it shows the variability across the orchard. High variability, but the overall mean clearly decreases after about 1 to 2 decades. In groundwater, therefore, we wouldn't expect a lot of changes very quickly. And in fact, that's what we're seeing across our monitoring well network. This is an orchard about 140 acres. We have 20 wells where we're measuring shallow groundwater quality from the water table at 20 feet to about 40 feet depth. And you can see over the years since 2015, there hasn't really been a lot of change in the pattern of concentrations or the magnitude of concentrations across this orchard. You also see how incredibly variable the concentrations are, and that has to do partly with the variability of the soil, partly with the variability of the aquifer below the soil, partly with the kind of variability that you all see in the orchard in terms of tree size and tree age and the non-uniformity in the irrigation and fertigation system. Another piece that I wanted to bring in here is we have moved from doing very poor irrigation efficiency and hence very poor nitrogen use efficiencies in the 20th century to very efficient irrigation and fertigation systems. It has slowed down the movement of water out of the root zone. It has helped us contain nitrate in the root zone so that the plants can use it. But getting the concentration down, now that we have less recharge, is a bit of a challenge. What helps with that is to do managed aquifer recharge. Managed aquifer recharge has become a very big topic this last winter. We had a lot of water sitting in the Sierra Nevada in a big snowpack. And we had opportunities to put a lot of the floodwaters coming off the Sierra Nevada potentially into orchards and other places. My colleague Helen Dahlke has done a lot of work on showing that we can put floodwaters into an almond orchard specifically for the purpose of recharging groundwater aquifers. One of the experiments she conducted in this orchard where in that lower central part where the red circle is, we built 3 basins that you can see here on the left side that were not that large. We put 30 feet of water through those basins in the course of 30 days. This is not a sandy soil. This is a sandy loam-to-loam soil. We were able to recharge a foot of water every day over a 30-day period. And the result was that the monitoring wells that are sitting right next to these ponds, and you see the yellow stick there in the front, immediately got flushed out and the nitrate concentrations were greatly reduced. And what Spencer's work is showing is that these kind of managed aquifer recharge operations may be able to help us to much more quickly improve groundwater quality below these orchards. This is a what-if simulation that goes all the way to the year 2100 that shows various amounts of water applied in these basins next to these wells, and how nitrate concentrations in shallow groundwater change over time as a function of how we manage this managed aquifer recharge. And you can see that if we were to apply the amount of water that we applied last year, say every 10 years, which is the green line, we get sort of a swinging in concentrations in the groundwater next to where we apply this water, but we decrease consistently and over long periods of time the nitrate concentration in groundwater, and we don't have to wait for that to go down just from the recharge that we occur without that managed aquifer recharge. Come to our poster, and we can explain more. Thank you very much.